Persona has become one of the most popular gaming series over the last decade or so, almost hogging the spotlight at times. But in order for the Persona series to get to this grand stage it stands at today, it needed a little help from the 1994 release of Shin Megami Tensei If on the Super Famicom, with it laying down some of the basic ideas and essential components that help identify and make the Persona games so adored. And so for this episode of Aligning Megami Tensei, we're going to take a look at Shin Megami Tensei If and see how it stacks up against the rest of the Megami Tensei games. Before we move on, make sure to subscribe to stay up to date as we review and rank every Megami Tensei game, and I'll forever be at your service. Now, I'm going to be honest, I like Shin Megami Tensei If. The game definitely ranks a few spots higher on my personal list than I know it actually should. But what if I didn't like it? Get it? No? Okay, I'll just move on. While I actually do enjoy this game quite a lot, I, along with a majority of people who have actually played this game, also realize that Shin Megami Tensei If leaves a lot to be desired at times, with most of its issues being almost blatantly clear. Although it does act as a rough blueprint for the Persona series, additionally receiving some fairly positive comments at the time of its release, Shin Megami Tensei If just doesn't do enough as a whole. This doesn't mean that the game has nothing going for it, because it does, and it still manages to feel like a great proof of concept, bringing a bit of innovation and challenge. But a lot of the execution does fall short, with the game never fully realizing the actual potential I believe it to actually have. Some really rough impressions and the bad aftertaste it leaves on players due to how it handles picking routes practically overshadow and cripple a lot of the things it does well at, as not only does it fail to draw any major parallels between a what-if situation of Shin Megami Tensei 1, instead taking place in a completely unrelated, isolated school with new characters, but additionally tries to bank in on a replayability factor by tricking the player to commit to the worst path in the opening moments, which happened to me. And this translates into its fairly unique yet simple setup and its wasted potential of expanding it into a more grand narrative, with you taking the role as a student at Kurokazaka High School. While randomly sitting in class, the school gets transported to another dimension after a demon summoning spell is performed by Hazuma, a bullied classmate. You'll be prompted by Yumi, another fellow classmate, to go with her, and naturally you'll say yes, thinking this is just a normal part of the progression, the next step into figuring out what's going on, and technically it is. But what the game doesn't tell you is that there are two other characters you can choose instead, each with their own slightly varied and better path. What the game also doesn't tell you is that saying yes to Yumi will lock you out of the true ending and the final boss of the game, tying back to my previous comment on trying to bank in on the replayability factor by tricking the player into committing to the worst path. Regardless of who you actually end up joining up with, 90% of the game plays virtually the same, making your way through the school until reaching the expanse containing the 5 domains you'll need to go through. Each domain, or in more simple terms, dungeon, is inspired by one of the 7 deadly sins, which is a pretty cool idea in my opinion, and something I wish was thematically better incorporated both from a narrative perspective and dungeon design wise. Even though it's fairly loose, it's pretty easy to make the connection between each domain's 7 deadly sin and Hazuma's impressions on his peers. Though, aside from the initial dialogue given when entering a new dungeon and a few other NPCs scattered around, not much else is provided. Any deeper connection between these parts of the game and the story is mostly left up to the player's interpretation during their journey. As for the dungeon designs, well, we'll get into that in a little bit. After defeating each dungeon's boss, you'll end up receiving one of the 5 rings needed to reach the end stages of the game, and ultimately return your school back to your dimension. Or, in some other cases, just defeat the final boss. Really, it's a simple but neat concept, and one that I find myself enjoying more because of its core gameplay and unique presentation, at least unique for the time of its release. But in order to get the full experience and its full story, you'll need to play the game 4 times, as each route spreads different parts of information in them, with some being more important, interesting, or just flat out better than others. And let's face it, even though I like this game, I don't like it that much to play it 4 times for a story that feels barely present on a single playthrough. Okay, I'm sure I'll eventually do this, but for the sake of keeping my sanity while making this video, no thanks. Excluding Akira's storyline, each playthrough plays pretty much the same throughout. Each route's final boss, end dungeon, ending, and available equipment depending on the character's gender change, which really doesn't come across as too much of a surprise. After all, it's a Megaten game, and an old one at that. But like I mentioned a few times already, locking the player into a route within the first 2 minutes is what makes this so frustrating and pushes me from giving it another go. While I personally like the concept of what Shin Megami Tensei If is going for with its premise, it doesn't do itself any favors with its poor guidance, minimal core substance, and withholding details from specific storylines. Maybe if I wasn't tricked into taking the worst path at the very beginning, I'd be inclined to give Reiko or Charlie's route a go. Still, there are a number of smaller details that do make up a bit for these blunders. with its small scale environment making it easy to pick up the pieces of what's happening rather quickly. Both the artwork and animations are aspects that I found to match the atmosphere and help keep me invested in the game as well. And though it's not a dialogue heavy, story driven game, there's enough unveiled from the NPCs in the school and dungeons, keeping things mildly entertaining and amplifying the unnatural ambience of the game. But once you've actually made your way to the first dungeon, any story or character development pretty much stops, with nothing else being added, shifting its focus to the rest of the gameplay and dungeon crawling. Outside of Hazama, I don't think there's really any character development at all. Sure, having each dungeon's main boss being inspired by one of the 7 deadly sins is actually a cool idea, but there's nothing brought from their involvement. Very little information is given about them, the expanse never feels like it grows as you move on, and there's no further story development. You're just going from one dungeon to the next. Clearing a domain doesn't add anything new besides unlocking the next one to explore. Comparing this to some of the Megaten titles we've already looked at, Shin Megami Tensei If isn't really helping its case as being one of the better Megaten games so far. Fortunately, its core gameplay is on par, if not a solid improvement compared to Shin Megami Tensei 1 and Shin Megami Tensei 2, bringing a much cleaner presentation to its combat, party, recruiting, and fusion systems. While most of these don't feel entirely new, Shin Megami Tensei If's revamped take brings a quicker pace, better parity, and less frustrating mechanics overall, outside of the dungeons that is, allowing a large portion of the core gameplay to remain effective throughout, especially when it comes to the combat, which in my opinion is the best of all the Super Famicom Megaten games. Much of what the game has to offer here is a pretty familiar concept, with the counters being random and the combat used in a turn-based system. Its general approach hasn't changed all that much, if at all, with most details still being given to the player, yet much more manageable or easier to understand. Your party's status and the commands are managed from the bottom of the screen once a battle begins, while the number of enemies you're facing and their status will remain visible at the top. Mostly, minor tweaks are implemented here to improve the overall quality of life with this part of the game. The clean menu UI also improves the flow of combat by making it simple to assign commands and move between the many menus without taking too much screen real estate. That isn't to say you won't run across a few issues here and there though. The occasional spam attacks or walls of enemies are still very much present. The sense of feeling underleveled and needing to grind a bit before moving on is also something you'll need to face at times. But this is an older Megaten game that we're talking about here. It'd be weird not to encounter these issues. And while the main protagonist dying does send you all the way back to the beginning of a dungeon, its lax encounter rate and improved enemy UI does make this setback somewhat tolerable. Personally, there were very few times I actually died throughout this game. Its party system mechanics that draw inspiration from Shin Megami Tensei 2's front and back row system adds a layer of strategy to the combat in addition to building your party, and I'm all for it, as I think it's a great system to break the mold of a standard turn-based combat system, limiting the attack options from members positioned in the back in exchange for some extra cover support, enabling you to give priority to certain demons that might not fare well against the tougher hitting enemies. Though I don't find it to be as flourished as Soul Hacker's front and back row system since the opposing demons are just lined up here. It's still pretty effective for the most part though. However, what gives these parts of the game their unique flair is through Shin Megami Tensei If's introduction of the Guardian system, a precursor to how personas are used in the Persona series. While it may have a few glaring issues, they're fairly easy to get past once you understand the baggage it comes with, and I found myself appreciating the unique concept for its time a lot, with it automatically assigning both your human protagonist a demon, or in this sense, a guardian, in order to fight against the other demons. As expected, your guardian acts as the source to your strength and skills. This being an older Megaten game, however, won't grant any skills to the main protagonist, despite still having the option to level up their magic stat. Seriously, this is one of the dumbest things about the older games. It makes absolutely zero sense to have the option of leveling up your magic if you can't even use any skills. I mean, what was Atlas thinking at the time? Were they even thinking? I absolutely hate Persona 5. Anyways, unlike the more recent Persona titles though, you won't be given the freedom to change your guardian for either character. That's right, this is a no takesy backsies type situation. Kind of. New guardians are selected at random when you or your other human party member dies. However, this does come with its pros and cons, as frequently dying will result in a weaker guardian being chosen, not only bringing very few skills to use, but additionally lowering your stats as well, and if you get a weaker guardian, you're gonna have a bad time. On the other hand though, managing to stay alive for a longer period of time and defeating a number of enemies can eventually lead to a pretty powerful guardian if and when you actually do die, which you will. There is a gauge to get an idea of how strong your next guardian may be when viewing one of your human character's statuses. I had no idea how to find this for about 5 hours though. This gauge does take a while to fill up, so just be patient. That's really the only advice I can give you on that. and if you're lucky enough to die in a full moon, your chances of getting an extremely powerful guardian also increase. Personally, I don't find the game to be overly challenging where I need to constantly upgrade my guardian, but it is fun to see what demon I'll get next. Really, my biggest issue comes from the fact that the guardians come with their own set of skills and stats that also affect the human they're assigned to, meaning that each time you die, it's likely you'll need to adjust your party to some degree to make up for the updated skill set or even in some cases, the decreased stats. Fortunately, this doesn't completely replace every single ability of your accompanying party member, but you will notice a few changes that might be enough to change the dynamic of your party entirely. And since the game doesn't tell you what a skill does, you're going to be doing a lot of trial and error at the beginning, if you're not already familiar with how Megaten skills are used. Clearly, there are a few ups and downs with this system, but it's a unique concept for its time that does a good job for the most part. Though this may not be everyone's favorite Megaten mechanic, its influence on how personas are used shouldn't be overlooked. And while this does bring a new dynamic to your party, you'll still find yourself relying a lot on both the game's recruiting and fusion systems, with both almost remaining virtually unchanged compared to their predecessor titles, only tweaking a few aspects, if any at all, though neither disappoint in my opinion. Recruiting does feel a bit more chaotic than usual due to its handling of dialogue during negotiations, making demons feel more rebellious, but in a middle schooler hitting puberty kind of way, if that makes any sense. Keep in mind that your guardian alignment will have a bit influence on recruiting, which can be a bit frustrating to get used to. The game's decision to have some dialogue options unequip your weapon or armor is also a bit of a questionable choice. And similar to the issues I discussed with forgetting to rearrange my party when ambushed in my Soul Hackers review, I also forgot to re-equip my weapon every time this happened. Also, if you haven't watched my Soul Hackers review, check it out after this video. For the most part though, the rest of recruiting and negotiations are pretty standard, with early recruiting giving a bit of a pushback, while the later stages see demon alignments influencing a demon's decision, as well as your party's arrangement in general. It doesn't take long to find out the useful dialogue options to either recruit a new demon or get an item though, which comes in handy quite a bit as healing in a dungeon isn't as generous as one might think. After a while though, you'll manage to stock up on a few demons to fuse, which is probably the least revamped aspect of the game, yet still extremely effective. Due to the minimal changes here though, there isn't too much to really discuss, as it's a pretty standard fusion system that allows you to fuse 2 or 3 demons for a new one. Just like the 2 prior games, the number of available demons to fuse does feel limited at times. Shin Megami Tensei If is probably the most restrictive in this regard, given it's a much smaller game, but it's still an overall solid experience. While weapons fusion still remains a pretty incorporated component, which is something I've always been a fan of and which more modern games would bring back. For the most part though, both systems keep the formula pretty in line with what's already been established in the previous 2 games, and I don't see an issue with that. Instead, they act as trustworthy and complementary pieces that help obscure some problems with the Guardian system's execution while keeping it at the forefront. Now, an issue that can't be obscured by anything is this game's dungeons. This is quite possibly Atlas at its worst when it comes to overall design and mechanics for dungeons. At the very least, it's hovering around the top of the list. And I think this may be the biggest letdown of the entire game, as the concepts behind these dungeons is something that I personally find interesting. Yet, like I mentioned earlier, these concepts aren't realized to its fullest potential, not even halfway. While visual-wise there are some significant improvements that make navigating through these parts fairly manageable, both the details and themes behind them are pretty bland. This isn't to say that there aren't some parts that are worth praising though. Personally, I found the small towns in each dungeon to be pretty convenient and unique, providing a chance to catch my breath, upgrade my equipment or party, or just talk to the few individuals dwelling in these areas. Though they don't necessarily bring a whole lot to elevate the dungeons as a whole, they do at least bring a bit of an ominous presence. And the minimal need for backtracking is also very much welcomed. While it does make the already fairly linear game feel even more linear, I don't necessarily see this as a bad thing. Those remarks aside, nearly every dungeon comes across as an uninspired design that really brings nothing to the table in terms of a true dungeon crawling experience. Their heavy reliance on gimmicks such as transporters, trapdoors, and meticulous puzzle mechanics extend the most mundane parts of the game further, sucking away any joy that the game can actually bring, and truly testing the man-child in you at times. Yes, I'm talking about you, World of Sloth. It should be noted that Emulator can help with some of these issues, but it's still not the best. And though there are some correlations these mechanics have with the specific 7 Deadly Sin, like I mentioned earlier, it's pretty thin, and story-wise, it's really up to the player to connect the dots. Really, it almost feels like what's presented is an afterthought or unused recycled ideas from previous titles. What makes these issues even more frustrating is that there's zero explanation given in so many cases. The game just decides, yep, this player's smart, they'll figure it out. Well, guess what? I'm not that smart. Though some are pretty simple to figure out, they aren't exactly fun or rewarding once you do clear them. You'll still dread most of them, especially the World of Sloth, which forces you to wait as students dig new areas of the dungeon for you to explore. This, in theory, isn't a bad idea, except that in order for the dungeon to expand, you'll have to wait several moon cycles, which requires you to move around. Meaning you can't set the game in idle mode and wait for a few hours. It just makes absolutely no sense that such a mundane requirement is needed with no additional quest or development for the player to take on while waiting. Not only that, but since your entire school is stuck slaving away digging holes, there's no one to talk to. I'm actually getting secondhand embarrassment from the fact that somebody actually thought this was a passable idea for the game. Though the rest of the game's small scale environment is refreshing and a nice change of pace, the dungeons almost bring nothing compared to actually what they could, and where I find the game struggling the most. Nor does it match the rest of the game's presentation or visuals, which are actually pretty solid, and are something that I've always adored about Megami Tensei, but especially the older games, as the rest of Shin Megami Tensei If's visuals, graphics, and music all come across as strong parts of the game that feel unique. And yes, I know that Shin Megami Tensei If's soundtrack is basically just enhanced versions of tracks from Shin Megami Tensei 1 and 2, they still slap harder than any 99 level Jigglypuff though. While there are moments where the game does feel or look clunky at times, everything still manages to be a cohesive piece of the game that stands out in an overall positive manner. It also has such a great look for a Super Famicom title, never feeling like it's trying to do more than what it's needed to do, excluding the dungeons. Things like the animations don't feel overly flashy, and a lot of the boss demon designs are incredible. I personally love the animation and dialogue of having demons preparing meals in the second domain. While its clean UI makes it simple to navigate through, and the attention to detail with the school and classrooms are nicely incorporated, helping bring a completely different vibe than the previous titles. While all of it may not hold up to today's standards for some, I find them to be aspects that complemented the entire premise, playing a big part as to why I find myself enjoying the game so much. Before I get into my final thoughts and ranking of the game, there are two things I want to briefly discuss. The first being Shin Megami Tensei If's 2002 PS1 pre-release, which modernized the game's graphics and character art, added an easy mode, and perhaps most importantly, greatly improved the mechanics of the dungeons. Although the dungeon mechanics and some tedious inventory issues are fixed, I personally don't feel like enough was done to make it worth playing the game again. Honestly, I'd rather stick with the Super Famicom version, mostly because I can't stand the direction the character art took. I just feel like the new art style takes away from the original vibe, and the PS1 version doesn't quite hit the same as the original visuals. That being said, I'd recommend an emulated Super Famicom version over the PS1, but that's just my personal preference. If you're playing this game for the first time, either version gets the job done really. More importantly though, is the game's post-game content, which unlocks the fourth and final storyline after beating the game once. Technically, I think you just need a save file after reaching the final dungeon, but you've already gotten this far, so just beat the game first, right? Also, I'm not 100% sure if that's the case, as I actually didn't test it out myself. If there's someone that does know, let me know in the comments below. Ironically though, this is the best part of the entire game. Not only is it the strongest of the 4 stories in Shin Megami Tensei If, but it's also peak Super Famicom Megaten, as the story follows Akira and the protagonist attempting to escape the school at the very beginning, before being confronted and attacked by Hazama. On the brink of death, Akira fuses with another demon and decides to travel up the Tower of Confinement to find and defeat Hazama. It's essentially a single dungeon with several floors where you work your way to the top. The shift in the gameplay makes it feel like a completely new experience, and a better one at that. The core mechanics are still the same, but the dungeon structure fits this style of playthrough much better than the other 3 routes. It's honestly a shame that this is locked until playing through the entire game once, as I think had this been one of the available routes on the first playthrough, the game's reputation might have been salvaged a bit. It's still a solid post-game addition and definitely worth checking out if you manage to get through the game once. It offers a much better presentation and a much more engaging playthrough. With that said, let's wrap this review up and see where Shin Megami Tensei If ranks amongst the other Megaten games. Now yes, I like this game. I like the concepts it brings and can see what the developers were going for, and apparently Atlus saw this as well years later down the line. But like I mentioned at the very beginning, and basically throughout the entire review, there are quite a few obvious issues. And just like I have so far with this ranking series and will continue to do, my personal preferences or biases towards a game don't play a significant part, if any, for a game's ranking. So while it's a fun game to me, the reality is that Shin Megami Tensei If is just not a good game. Its bare bones narrative, lack of any real character development, pretty disastrous dungeon designs, and poor execution are all pretty bad. Oh, and we also can't forget about how the game handles players choosing their routes. Unless you really want to see what the older Megaten games were like, or really want to see the precursor to the Persona series, I don't see a reason to play this game. Meaning, Shin Megami Tensei If gets a strong pass from me. As for its ranking amongst the other Megaten games, it falls in the D tier. It surely doesn't feel as numbing as Card Summoners does at times, but it isn't above the other 2 titles replaced in the C tier so far. The inclusion of the 7 Deadly Sins, school setting, and introduction of the Guardian system are all worth receiving some praise, even if they don't pan out well as a whole. It also has the best combat from the SNES era Megaten titles. Other than that though, the game just doesn't bring that much to the table, and what it does bring isn't a full meal's worth. But with that said, let me know what you think of Shin Megami Tensei If down in the comments below. If there's a game you want to see me review in the near future, share that as well, and I'll forever be at your service.